Hey everyone. This evening we'll start with the gloomy, perilous, and unglamorous world of medieval assassins. Those eerie individuals who used a blade and a whisper to alter history as they slipped through dimly lit alleys and castle corridors. Hollywood portrays them as awesome, but in reality, becoming a medieval assassin was a terrible idea. It's always interesting to see who is joining us from all over the world, so before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. Also, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Now, turn off the lights. Perhaps turn on a fan to provide a gentle background hum as we begin our journey together tonight. Let's be clear. You know what? I'd like to stab a nobleman in the throat for 12 silver coins and the honor of hiding in a barrel for 3 days. Remarked no one when they woke up in the Middle Ages. Being an assassin wasn't a way to make a living. It was more akin to the final stop on the train of a life gone terribly wrong. The majority of medieval assassins were either desperate peasants, disgraced soldiers, former robbers with good aim, or someone so out of the public eye that they could kill a man and still go unnoticed in the census. They weren't enigmatic loners who had received training in mountaintop shrines. If you were wealthy, you didn't become an assassin. Instead, you hired one. If you had land or even a goat, you were in management. However, if you had just left Data's prison, you were known for being able to solve problems and enter a tavern covertly. Congratulations. Someone was going to mumble a name and slide a coin purse across the table, and it wasn't a pleasant one. No one asked you to remove Bob, the silent turnip farmer. Usually, it was a dishonest baron, a wealthy bishop, or someone with a moat and 12 bodyguards. When someone thought about it, they had nothing left to lose despite the job being horrible and the compensation being alluring. Without family, without a future, and without a dental plan, of course. Not to mention the complete dearth of benefits offered by the employer. You couldn't precisely hang up a shingle that read, "Quiet eliminations by appointment," without a pension, honor, or evenings off. You simply needed to keep quiet, move quickly, and never disclose your occupation to anyone. Not loudly over ale in the inn, in particular. Yes, I sell carpets on the road. You know, the stains dye. Indeed, nobody had aspirations of being a medieval assassin. Wearing a hood and brandishing a rusty knife, they landed there after being chewed up and spat out by the world. You weren't the protagonist. Even you weren't the bad guy. You were the addendum that caused anxiety in everyone, and most likely prevented them from enjoying the coin. Let's dispel the first myth completely. Assassins in the Middle Ages did not practice by candlelight in a secret monastery with sage teachers and uplifting flute music playing in the background. No montage was shown, no instructor, no motivational speech. The majority of assassins were desperate amateurs with a reasonable sense of direction and the ability to climb silently without sneezing. If you had military experience, that meant you knew how to hold a knife properly. If not, stabbing someone is fairly intuitive, but escaping later with both kidneys intact takes skill or luck. If you learned anything, it was from not dying the first few times you tried. Usually, it's just luck. No instructions were available. No meetings for guild orientation. Absence of safety instructions. You weren't taught where nobility kept their bedroom exits or how to recognize a body double. Wondering if you had simply sneaked back into the servants' quarters, you figured it out while suspended from a window ledge. Poisoning. That was trial and error, with a strong focus on making mistakes. It occasionally worked. Sometimes you drank the wrong cup of soup, while other times your target simply became a little lightheaded and suspicious. Medieval poison control hotlines did not exist. I hope you have a strong stomach and herbal guessing. Yes, you might have learned certain talents from mercenaries or thieves if you were lucky. I mean, lottery lucky. Perhaps you learned how to walk on cobblestones without squeaking from an elder assassin. Mentoring, however, wasn't common. It was uncommon and fleeting since killers don't retire. They just vanish. Forget about weapons training. You did not have a broadsword with you. You took a dagger from a guard, and if you were feeling really fanciful, you might have added a garrote or anything else that would fit beneath your cloak without jingling. Therefore, no, you weren't a mysterious martial arts expert. You were a man with rough hands, soft footsteps, and a really bad connection to alleyways. Survival, not training, was the key to success. You became proficient at killing by acting hastily and disappearing before someone could draw your face and affix it to a church door. To put it briefly, you had a brutally practical education with no graduation celebrations. Let's discuss why you became an assassin in the first place. All you have are bruises, bloodstains, and the nagging sense that you are largely alone. Cold, weighty, wonderfully jangling coin that can be spent. What drew you in was the promise of it, but in actuality, you were paid lies. When an assassin is hired, they seek a one-time service rather than a committed connection. They give you a pouch of silver, half now and half after the job is over, if they're feeling giving. However, here's the thing. There should be no paperwork and ideally no witnesses, including you. After we make sure you didn't mess it up, make us seem bad, leave a trail that points back to us, or live long enough to tell anyone about it, the code is for after the work is finished. You perform your duties, risk your life by slinking through shadows, and maybe killing a baron while he sleeps. It's neither poetic or lovely. When you return, the client has apologized profusely and fled. Or worse, they are attempting to kill you. A gut punch is less expensive than a bonus. Additionally, even when you do receive compensation, it's never enough. For the 3 days you spent hiding in a haystack with fleas and moral remorse, not for the danger, not for the blood, you receive a few coins, a reminder, and a little nod. You never showed up. Fun fact, some contracts weren't real. Political pitfalls. You would be instructed to kill a dangerous person, only to discover that it was a ruse with guards on standby. Congratulations. Your name was already engraved on the gallows when you entered a sting operation, and even when the agreement was genuine, you were unable to go to court and lodge a complaint. I would like to sue Lord Edmund for breach of assassination contract, Your Honor. Since the only court you would ever see was the one in which you were the exhibit, you learned to accept what you could demand in advance and to have complete faith in no one, not even the oily little writer who vowed that this work would improve your life, mostly by making it shorter. Living off of broken promises and disappearing before they broke you was what it meant to be an assassin. You accepted the position after being misled about the salary. You will most likely perish. Let's speak about gear now. Ignore the espionage video games and fantasy books. No retractable wrist blades were present. Smoke bombs, crossbows that fit nicely in your boot, or magical daggers. Everything you could take, sharpen, or conceal under a frayed cloak without making a sound was part of your toolkit. You were fortunate to have a good dagger if you were fortunate enough to find a gold coin in a deceased person's shoe. Not curved like a dragon's tooth, nor elaborate. It should be sharp, free of rust, and ideally not smell like the last person you stabbed with it. Toxins. It did exist, but it lacked the glitz and glamour of a gradual drip into a wine goblet. The majority of medieval poisons were erratic and created from toad guts, minerals, or plants. Some were operational right away. Some took hours, while others caused your victim to throw up for 2 days before getting better. I'm furious and distrustful of Stu now. Ropes are sometimes helpful. Nothing detracts from the mood like attempting to wrestle someone while moaning, "Wait, which knot goes under again?" You could use one to strangle, climb, or tie anything up. But you'd better know how to move quickly. Bows. Yes, it would be effective if someone knew how to shoot it and wasn't attempting to sneak it past a palace while posing as a flower arranger. The majority of assassinations were intimate. You didn't have backups, so there was no time for graceful marksmanship. Just quick, quiet, and hopefully not dirty enough to slide in. Should your blade break or fall into a well, it's time to get creative. Perhaps a slate roof tile, rusty nail, worth a try with purpose, the shoe buckle, times of desperation. You kept your tools near at hand, not for safety, but because in this line of business, your weapon was your boss, closest friend, and only retirement plan. You concealed them in your boots or, if necessary, inside hollowed-out bread. Between missions, there were no upgrades or equipment fiddling. Since it wasn't the weapon that killed you in the end, you didn't polish your kit and hoped it wouldn't turn on you in the middle of an attack. You were the only one who was ill-prepared and expected to work miracles with just a spoon and a prayer. The purpose of hiring assassins was not to eliminate drunks in back alleys. You were not paid to stab anyone. Jeff, the drowsy candlemaker. Your goals were significant: bishops, military commanders, and occasionally even members of the royal family. Not a single or 24 well-fed, armed, and armored. The front and the back were guarded by several. Some simply stood there, scaring you and daring you to blink incorrectly. Before the asthmatic night required a break, you would spend days learning patrol routines, door creaks, and the precise number of stairs. Secondly, there were walls. Castles had moats filled of sharp objects and gated murder holes instead of front porches. Boiling oil and arrow slits were still a concern, even if you avoided falling into the lake. Indeed, boiling oil. You risk having your job description revoked for peeking. Third, there were the maids. Employ the stable guys, scribes, and cooks. If you gave them the wrong look, they would be whispering to the guard captain before you could say, "I'm just the herbalist." In addition to fighting swords, assassins also engaged in light-speed gossip, which spreads quickly in the Middle Ages if it allows someone to keep their head. Lastly, your real target is paranoid. These individuals were, understandably, surrounded by scheming relatives who claimed their titles and 36 people who pretended to like them. Without a tester, they didn't eat. Without 3 locks on the door, they couldn't sleep. Some even slept in rotating rooms or fake beds, which are lethal variations of musical chairs. Additionally, if you hear that they are attending a feast, don't get too enthusiastic. You will still need to get past the royal guards, even though they will be intoxicated. Tankers are being held by 50 witnesses, 3 dogs, and a vigilant jester. It can take weeks to even approach your goal. Bribing a chambermaid concealed in barrels while posing as a servant, and you only had one chance when the time arrived. During the night, a single, flawless, non-squeaky, non-bloody ghost disappeared. Otherwise, you would be the next public disincentive, hung from the castle gate with a placard that said, "Nice try." Really, you looked like a sick goat herder with something to conceal. When you think of a medieval assassin, you usually image elegant black robes, leather braces, and perhaps a mystery hood that billowed in the moonlight. During the Middle Ages, disguises weren't particularly fashionable. You had to make do with whatever you could find. such peasant rags, instead of having retractable armor or specially made cloaks. A monk's robe that was too large, or the remnants of a guard uniform that unmistakably still had the scent of its former owner. The objective was to blend in, but doing so meant appearing like everyone else who hadn't taken a shower in 2 weeks, hobbled from previous wounds, and twitched nervously from starvation. You didn't appear suspicious because of your cloak. Rather, you appeared suspicious because you were constantly shifting your belt to conceal a cheesecloth-wrapped dagger. Also, forget masks. There were no possibilities for male forks. The majority of face covers only made you appear leprous, which was excellent for avoiding conversation, but awful for going to events. You have to think quickly if someone questioned who you were. My name is Brother Tobias. I handle rooftop maintenance and silent prayer. Even if you managed to get past the guards, noble homes weren't teeming with fools. Aside from getting struck with a candlestick, servants would frequently notice new faces, particularly those who fumbled with chamber pots and couldn't identify the cook's cat. Congratulations if your disguise worked. You now had to spend hours acting as though you were unaware of all the extremely stab-worthy people passing by, and that wigs didn't exist. You were forced to spread dirt on your face, squint, and hope that no one could see that your beard was glued on with honey if you wanted to appear older or younger. In actuality, your disguise didn't keep you safe. Instead, it confused you for perhaps 5 minutes. After that, you had to disappear or appear extremely convincing. If someone caught on, well, let's just say that nobody wants to be the assassin discovered in the bishop's laundry room brandishing a sword and wearing a nun's habit, especially on a feast day. If you were an assassin in the Middle Ages, you didn't have a team, a crossbow-wielding sidekick, a cunning alchemist in a hidden lair, or a handler who offered you encouraging words and coded scrolls. You had serious trust issues and a rusty dagger. If there were rumors of a brotherhood of assassins, they were mainly pub chatter driven by me and boredom. There were no guilds, at least not ones you could truly rely on. Meeting a ghost was more likely than running into another professional killer looking to expand their network. The reason for the solitude was that in your line of work, the longer you survived, the fewer people knew you existed. Every interaction was dangerous, and every loose tongue could be a noose. Your client may not even be aware of your true name, and if they were, you were already preparing to go. Friendship. Laughable friends inquired. Bloodstains, bruises, and the reason you always slept with a blade beneath your pillow were noted by your lovers. You were unable to afford to settle down. Your entire life became a race to the closest sewer grate after one mistake and someone spotting you at a market. Even other criminals avoided each other. Smugglers and thieves were friendly. You were the person who makes people vanish. They viewed you as a walking liability, or worse, feared you. Nobody wanted to eat stew with someone whose line of work may draw a group of people brandishing torches, and nobody was expecting pity. After silently strangling a dishonest bishop, you couldn't express to anyone how difficult it was to fall asleep. You kept your secrets, scars, and weapons to yourself because others thought you were lying or dangerous if you talked about your work, and they weren't mistaken. Your eyes were constantly looking at the entrance as you sat in the darkest corner, facing the wall. You never overindulged in alcohol. You never remained more than one night. And you never spoke your name until someone paid you first. And even then, it was most likely not your genuine one. Mastering the knack of disappearing, not just from a crowd, but from every life you were never able to have, was essential to being a medieval assassin. Let's say you planned your route and accepted the job. The correct doorman was bought off by you. You pretended to be a very convincing chimney sweeper. Then you became motionless. Perhaps the target unexpectedly turned around. They might have been with their child. Perhaps you experienced the shakes at the most inconvenient time, and your knife hand shook like a scared squirrel. You're dead now. Guess what? Because failing as a medieval assassin wasn't considered a poor performance assessment or a slap on the wrist. Often incorporating ropes, fire wheels, or sharp iron objects with names like the Bone Cracker's Delight, it was a terrible and highly theatrical public death. The entire operation would be blown if the kill was missed. Your target survived and informed everyone right away that they had been the victim of a murder attempt. You were a wanted guy with a thorough description and most likely a rough sketch affixed on every pub wall within 30 meters, and those guards you had previously slipped past are now motivated. All of a sudden, you were no longer a shadow. Sometimes your client was the one you had to worry about, not even your target. If you failed, you were a burden rather than an asset. Someone who might be subjected to torture, questioning, or worse. Speak. There were no second chances, and the individuals who paid you would be the first to offer you a second contract. I apologize. The blade slipped. I'll try again tomorrow. You just got one chance, and the only thing you could hope for if you blew it was to pass very soon before anyone discovered who had hired you. Shame was another consequence of failure. The kind of humiliating silence you failed to be invisible in addition to failing to kill. Being flawless was essential to assassin's survival. If you don't, you might as well start practicing your last words and paint a bullseye on your back. No one was interested in your 12 successes, regardless of how many jobs you had completed in the past. Since you're only as good as your previous kill in this line of work, you'd better start running if that didn't happen. You did it then. The strategy was successful. The dagger made a real hit. Congratulations. There were no cries or guards, simply a clean descent to the ground and a very significant somebody who wasn't now. Flee for your life. Because in the Middle Ages, being a successful assassin did not entail drinking wine on a rooftop as the city burned in the background. It meant running through back alleyways with a dog already sniffing your trail and blood on your boots. There was no victory lap, no after-work drink with coworkers, and no informal debriefing with your customer. You didn't even have time to appreciate your work. After your blade struck, your new employment turned into a haven where everyone wanted to kill you in ever more creative ways. On the opposite side of town, guards are arriving with chained horses tied up, and you're probably bleeding. Before the kill, you had to arrange your escape. Routes conceal fallback safeces, given that the city will be placed under lockdown in a matter of minutes. Perhaps a boatman owed you a favor, or at the very least, refrained from asking questions. Lockdown meant armed checkpoints, closed gates, and a dozen irate men brandishing swords who had only gotten your crude sketch in the words, possibly armed and extremely stabby. Nobody wanted a controversy. Let's also discuss the client. They weren't going to greet you with a grin and a thank you note at a quaint bar, assuming they truly intended to pay you. They would most likely disappear as well, since an assassin who has recently finished a job is the most dangerous individual on the planet. Even after you succeeded, you left with a huge target on your back and a coin in one hand because you knew too much. What did you gain from a week of sleeping in hofts, bribing ferry captains, shaving your beard in the dark, and posing as Brother Lucian as you attempted to blend in with monks traveling east? You made the kill, so now run like hell because success didn't guarantee survival. It meant beginning the game over in a new city with a new name and even more people searching for you. because assassins weren't only feared, but also viewed as cursed in the Middle Ages. If being a medieval assassin wasn't already awful enough, poor, hounded, and sleeping in goat-smelling places, you also had to cope with the incredibly inventive paranoia of those around you. To the typical peasant, you were more than simply a hooded killer. You were an unclean creature who, during a full moon, smeared frog guts on your blade and spoke to demons. Although rationality wasn't particularly common at the time, superstition was pervasive. Otherwise, how else would you be able to slip past guards and disappear in the dark? Some people thought assassins could change their shape. Others asserted that unless you were cleansed with holy water, you were invisible. According to a well-known legend, killers could breathe death through walls and create pacts with woodland spirits. Imagine hearing a woman murmur, "Don't make eye contact," while strolling through a village. He could hex the infant, and even your instruments were dubious. Having a dagger on hand, it was obviously made in a forge that was cursed. It was witchcraft to use poison that wasn't chemistry, and you most likely stirred it with a severed toe under a blood moon. After all, people avoided you, so you would think that this dread would benefit you. But the truth was worse. Without hesitation, superstitious mobs throw stones, start fires, and yell things like, "Burn him," before he calls lightning. They also don't ask questions. People overreacted because of your reputation. When someone choked on a chicken bone or died of an untimely sickness, someone might mutter, "Perhaps it was a shadow man." It might have been him. You had to stay on the go since you might be hunted down for simply being in the same village as a suspected death. Always, after staying too long, a priest rings a bell and 5 irate farmers brandish pitchforks as if they've been waiting for this moment all their lives. God forbid you were caught in possession of anything even slightly strange. Strange coins, dried herbs, or even a foreign accent. That was all it took for someone to light a torch and yell, "Sorcerer." Being too fast, too bright, or too silent made you a threat in a society where monsters were thought to have human faces. According to medieval reasoning, threats had to perish quickly, ideally on fire. Oh, poison. The elegant weapon used by the assassin. Just a sip, a stagger, a sigh, and it's over. No mess, no shouting, no steel on bone. That's the theory. In actuality, poisoning someone during the Middle Ages was similar to using herbal tea and a negative attitude to win a bar brawl. To begin with, poisons weren't trustworthy. Purified cyanide and a convenient tiny tablet called fast-acting doom were not available to you. You had minerals, plants, mushrooms, and perhaps even the occasional toad. Even after gathering grind and prey, the target can experience a stomach pain and become even more dedicated to his anti-acid guard team. No scientific measurement was made. You didn't do it exactly right. It was eyeballed by you. The aristocrat simply throws up and cancels supper after taking one too little pinch. Before the first course is served, you will die from exposure if you pinch too much. Additionally, medieval kitchens were chaotic. You couldn't simply walk in and add nightshade to the soup. You had to bribe someone, pretend to be a cook, sneak in while no one was looking, or worse, try to contaminate food that would be consumed by a dog and 3 tasters. Indeed, a dog. Additionally, if your victim was a noble, they handled it like a military operation rather than merely eating meals. Everyone, from the jester to the steward, scented and tasted the meals. Even if you did it, you snuck in the poison, because by the time the meal reached their plate, it had gone through more security than a royal wedding. The target actually ate it without anyone noticing. The following section was completely unforeseen. It took hours for some toxins and days for others. Your mark is giggling at a joke for 1 minute. Who would they blame if they survived? You, the quiet man with the herbal knowledge and twitchy eyes, not the cook or the waiter. The next moment, he is holding his stomach and demanding to see his astrologer. Therefore, poisoning wasn't effective. It was dangerous, sluggish, and full of factors that weren't in your favor. If you were caught, you also wouldn't die quickly. You were questioned with instruments until you admitted to poisoning the dog and the duke. You would imagine that if you were able to alter history by overthrowing a despot who was undermining a royal line or putting an end to a political menace, someone would recall your name. Number. You were a killer. That implied that people were never supposed to remember your name. You were a rumor at best. Someone wearing a hood, a stranger with icy eyes, or the silent man who never finished his ale. Even though you sang the most iconic song of the century, the official record still lists your death as unknown. Actually, it was the main idea. Your client desired plausible deniability rather than a tale. People were safer and less likely to be poisoned by their own assassin if fewer people knew who did it. Thus, as soon as the job was completed, your name was buried. You didn't sign your work, you didn't boast, and you didn't keep trophies if you even used a real one. If someone did know your name, that was a loose end, because you didn't exist outside of the kill moment. Additionally, loose ends in your line of work had a very short lifespan, and honor was forgotten. For silence, there were no medals. There would be no stone monuments for the guy who used a single dagger to end a war in the middle of the night. If a noble desired a statue, they would have commissioned one for themselves. You received a wooden box, an unmarked grave, or, in the worst-case scenario, a head on a spike bearing the label traitor. There were times when your name was only known to curse you, turning you into a warning whisper. Avoid disobeying the king. Recall what transpired with Lord Ulrich, yes, and how the perpetrator vanished like a ghost. That was your legacy. Absence, not fame or fear. It was not intended for you to make a mark. You were meant to disappear. Additionally, staying long enough to gain notoriety was a deadly mistake, because heroes were remembered in the medieval era. You survived because the assassins were eliminated. You completed the task. You were even able to get paid. A miracle in and of itself. All you need to do now is keep your head down, stay low, and have faith that your customer will maintain their end of the bargain and keep your name safe. Correctly incorrect. Because there was a rule in the world of medieval assassination that was even more sacred than not getting caught. Never trust anyone, especially the person paying you. Your client, whether they were a noble, a merchant, or a bishop with extremely loose morals and ambition, didn't hire you out of respect, but rather because they needed something terrible done, and you were the most skilled tool in the shadows. You became a liability once the task was finished. You were dangerous to them as well as to their enemies because you knew too much about who wanted who dead, when, why, and possibly how much they were willing to pay for it. So what did they do? They either ghosted you or denied ever meeting you, or worse, they sent someone else after you to clean up and end the contract with a sharp object other than ink. There have even been instances where clients double-booked, hiring one assassin to complete the job and another to kill the first one right away after. This was a bold move, and it was also your last mistake because powerful people in the Middle Ages didn't bargain with assassins. Instead, they crushed them. If your client had any honor left, you might get paid and be left alone. But even then, you'd have to assume that they were watching you from a distance with someone already sharpening steel and memorizing your walk. You were the secret that couldn't talk, the shadow that couldn't stay. Even success wasn't enough to gain their trust because, in their eyes, if you killed once, you could kill again. And nobody, not even the person who hired you, wanted to be the next one. Let's say you managed to overcome the odds. You outlived your opponents, your employers, the falsehoods, the poisonings, the betrayals, and most likely your own moral compass. Now, you're definitely not retiring because assassins in the Middle Ages didn't have retirement plans. There were no silent seaside homes, no goodbye banquets, no gold coin pensions, and no appreciative murmurs. You either disappeared or frequently passed away rather than fading into a quiet existence. The issue was straightforward. You were never secure. People didn't want you retired. They wanted you forgotten, which usually meant buried. You had too many names in your memory, too many secrets in your thoughts, and too much blood on your hands, even if you quit your work. Additionally, even if no one pursued you, which is significant, you would still have to live in continual worry that someone could. That a young assassin who was keen to establish himself had recently been hired by a mysterious person who was once a threat. You have once again changed your name. You relocated to a village where nobody questioned you. You pretended to be a guard and sold herbs while pretending to be limp. But even then, you had trouble sleeping and stayed away from crowds. Every knock on the door made you cringe. Every stranger on the street might recognize you. You stopped dreaming because dreaming was dangerous. You couldn't love. You couldn't relax. You couldn't laugh too loudly. And you couldn't trust yourself either. You always sat facing the door and kept your dagger under the floorboard next to the pouch of coins you never touched because it still smelled like the man you earned it from. You led a ghostly life while posing as a man. The fact was that a medieval assassin had no endgame, simply a gradual, icy descent into obscurity with constant movement and observation until one day you vanished into thin air without anyone noticing. Perhaps that was the most you could hope for. By this point, you have most likely worked it out. Being an assassin in the Middle Ages wasn't noble, darkly romantic, or even very lucrative. Wrapped in blood-stained linen, it was a short-lived, gloomy, and ungrateful career that was followed by a list of individuals that desired your death. Because you would start with the incorrect presumptions, you wouldn't last even a day, let alone a week. That you would be slick and in control, a whisper in the dark, but in reality, you would be cold-blooded and just a wrong guess away from the noose. You would enter the town with your cloak tight and prepared for action, only to find that your target had relocated. The stable lad you paid for information just sold you out for a piece of bread and a mug of ale, and the guards are inebriated but irritable. At the wrong moment, you would freeze, stab the incorrect person. You are suddenly no longer a shadow after being noticed by a maid who used to see your face close to the chapel. You're the issue, so you run. But you're not accustomed to the medieval environment. The street's muck, uneven cobblestones, and the ridiculously high quantity of stray chickens a guard named Thomas, who recently got fired and is seeking a way to vent, tackles you after you slip and fall. And if you make it through that, you have to deal with the fallout. No future, no honor, and no allies. It just arouses suspicion and the growing understanding that even in the event of success, your only hope is to die old and alone in a village that still believes in fairies while hiding behind a false identity. The assassin's life was not cool. It was a vicious machine that ate people up and vomited out nothing but shadows. It promised power without peace and purpose without a place in the world, so no, you wouldn't endure. In fact, you shouldn't try. Silence was all that awaited you at the end. You didn't create history. You wiped yourself from it. Nobody would question the stillness, as nobody ever recalled your presence in the first place. She used to be Macedonia's dreaded queen. From an early age, Myrtle was immersed in mystery and ritual. Her upbringing was influenced not only by politics, but also by prophecy, ecstatic rites, and a reverence for the ancient gods. Olympus was known as Myrtale, a Maloyan princess from the rough tribal lands of Epirus. Her people claimed descent from Achilles himself. Whether or not the blood of heroes truly ran in her veins, one thing was certain. This was not a woman born for the periphery. She wasn't the kind of princess who made tapestries and grinned. No, she was attracted to the frenetic rituals of the worship of Dionysus, where women danced barefoot in the moonlight and invoked the divine in trance, as well as the omens of serpents. Her relationship with the gods wasn't a theatrical one. It was intimate. She did more than just worship. She kept sacred snakes in her rooms, and even let them coil next to her in bed, according to ancient sources that were probably penned by men who were both frightened and fascinated. We'll never know if this was a true statement or the kind of slander that attracts powerful women like flies, but to her supporters, it made her seem divine. It made her dangerous to her adversaries. Her true strength first appeared in the unsettling flicker of torchlight, amid the murmurs of priestesses and the curled bodies of serpents, not in a battlefield or throne room. Not only was she a princess, a living oracle, she was a woman influenced by something colder than steel and older than politics. Philip II of Macedon, who was cruel, brilliant, and notoriously lustful, met a mystery he couldn't ignore when he traveled to the island of Samothrace for a religious initiation. Their marriage wasn't merely a political partnership. Rather, it was a collision of power and prophecy, and it was full of omens from the start. Some claimed that on their wedding night, lightning hit the sky, while others said that Olympias dreamed of a thunderbolt entering her womb. All of these stories would go down in history, but one thing is for sure. Alexander the Great was the product of Olympias and Philip's coupling, and she meant to influence his fate from the moment of his birth. The union of Olympia and Philip II was hardly what one could anticipate from a queen who would eventually establish an empire. It was a volatile combination of paranoia and prophecy pride from the start. Around 357 BCE, Philip, who was cunning, charming, and already collecting wives like trophies, wed Olympias. She wasn't naive, even though she was probably only a teenager. She recognized in Philip a man who shared her ambitions and who might perhaps be a divine fit for her spiritual path. Olympias, Papyrus's priestess, entered Macedon with her head held high and her eyes already on the throne. Macedon was a realm of iron and ambition, where brothers were instantly turned into competitors and monarchs were assassinated by relatives. Their union was troubled from the beginning. Despite his political prowess, Philip was not suited for monogamy. Olympias would later marry other women, frequently in order to form alliances and gain power, but he wasn't one to remain in the background. She maintained her own court, made her own relationships, and was known to use rites and oracles to predict her own and maybe Philip's fate. Alexander's birth followed. Celestial drama even surrounded that. According to legend, Olympus dreamed that a thunderbolt had struck her womb and that her unborn child was surrounded by dancing flames without being burned. According to reports, Philip saw a vision of using a real lion to seal his wife's womb. They acted as though Alexander was destined to rule not just a kingdom, but the entire world. whether they believed these visions or made them up. However, even as the child was being celebrated, Olympus resented Philip's other wives, particularly his Macedonian bride, Cleopatra Eurydice, whom he married later in life. This was not only a home problem, it posed a danger. Since Cleopatra was born in Macedonia, the local nobility would view any son she had as being more pure. Olympia plainly saw it as a direct danger to Alexander's future. She would employ every serpent dream ritual and whisper she possessed to ensure that her son was not only remembered, but also crowned, because the palace was more than just a house. It was a battlefield. She had changed from being Myrtle. No one would ascend to her son's throne without incurring her wrath, because she was now Olympus. The Macedonian palace in Pella had devolved into a battlefield of covert taunts, scheming, and acrimonious rivalries by the time Alexander was a teenager. Olympus was fighting for her life, not just for power. She was aware that there were many snakes in the court, but she was the one who taught them how to bite. Philip II had started to turn away from her. He was advocating for greater drinking, and worse, paying more attention to his Macedonian advisors. His marriage to a young, noble woman named Cleopatra Eurydice, not to be confused with the Cleopatra of Egypt, was the last straw. This Cleopatra was born in Macedonia, and one of Philip's most important generals was her uncle, Attalus. For Olympias, the marriage ceremony was a catastrophe, and it was more than simply betrayal. It was a declaration of war. During the feast, Attalus made fun of Alexander and Olympus while intoxicated, casting doubt on Alexander's birth certificate. Although Olympus liked to say it was an insult, Olympia grabbed the myth and asked whether he was actually Philip's son or the kid of a deity. Let them mutter that her son became untouchable when Zeus touched him. Macedon completely fled to Opris as Alexander stormed out of the feast, but her banishment was a calculated move rather than a failure. She remained a princess in her native country. She didn't need to be physically present to be harmful. She could gather support, whisper in ears, and watch as Philip's palace started to decay from the inside out. The shock wave then arrived. As Philip prepared to invade Persia, he was slain at his daughter's wedding. He was about to declare himself not only the king of Macedon, but also the prospective emperor of the entire world. The identical query reverberated through each marble hallway and hall illuminated by torches. Who was responsible for the act? Was it Porcinius, the betrayed bodyguard? Was it court intrigue? Was it Alexander? Or was it Olympus, who no one could prove? Many people believed it, but no one dared. After all, Cleopatra Eurydice and her infant son died within a few days. The snake had returned to the palace, and nothing stood between her son and the throne after being murdered, according to some, by Olympus herself. Olympias took action after Philip passed away, and Macedon was either in mourning or confused. She acted quickly, brutally, and decisively as others frantically tried to comprehend the turmoil. The young Macedonian queen and competing wife, Cleopatra Eurydice, was first removed. According to horrifying reports, Olympus humiliated her in public and used her death as a symbol. Some claim that after witnessing the murder of her infant daughter, Cleopatra was compelled to hang herself. According to others, Olympus had the youngster tossed onto a funeral procession. This is what has been decided. Olympia realized that many mothers in ancient courts hesitated to accept the fact that no pity was shown. Mercy is a liability in a royal castle. No matter how minor, a rival youngster may start a future conflict, and Olympias was done playing defense. After Cleopatra and her lineage were exterminated, she could focus on securing Alexander's crown. Don't be duped, though. her adolescent son, who had already had Aristotelian training, was proclaimed king with little protest. It was made feasible by more than just his charm or his father's legacy. Alexander didn't always agree with her. He reportedly disapproved of the violence against Cleopatra's family, but he also didn't stop it because he knew deep down what Olympias had always known. Power demands. It was Olympus, and she knew which generals to threaten, which nobles to flatter, and which enemies to subtly remove. Bloodlines were both a boon and a bane in Macedonia. With her son, King Olympias, started to fade away from public life at this point. Yet she just moved from open strikes to whispered influence without retiring, and as Alexander got ready to. She stayed behind to begin his invasion of Persia, serving as the spiritual protector of his fate. She conducted ceremonies, consulted oracles, and sent him holy relics. Her son's mission to Olympus was not merely military, it was heavenly, and Alexander wasn't. He was carrying out his prophecy by going to war, and as long as she was breathing, there was no competition. The holy scheme she had crowned would be derailed, whether it was Macedonian, Persian, or not. After cleaning the palace for her son, she would now protect his empire from behind. Olympus stayed behind as Alexander marched east to capture the known world, exposing his teeth in the curtain. Macedon, a queen with authority but no throne, was officially known as Queen Mother, but don't lose sight of the fact that she ruled in all but name. Olympus refused to be marginalized, even though it was officially turned over to Antipater, one of Alexander's trusted generals. She wrote letters to her kid that are continually warning him and occasionally reprimanding him weren't the tender letters of a loving mother. Rather, they were venomous and oracle-laced political briefs. She reminded Alexander of his true identity while he read every word from thousands of miles away. She insulted his opponents and questioned the fidelity of his friends. No one else dared to share his obsession with Persian rituals, his choice of women, or his attempt to claim divinity. Tell him these things, but Olympias never shied away from speaking as a mother or a priestess of divine will. Antipater became more and more bitter back in Macedon. Olympia used her position and religious authority to undercut him at every opportunity. Using her familial connections to incite resistance against him, she was powerful in Epirus. She could spread tales like wildfire, and with Olympus, a murmur among the nobility and throughout Thessaly might be more lethal than a sword. In the meantime, her correspondence with Alexander grew increasingly. She painted him as a second Philip who was prepared to betray and usurp, and she urgently warned him of Antipat's desire. She persisted in pressuring her son to behave, whether because she genuinely believed it or because she was afraid of losing control. However, Alexander was hesitant since he needed Antipater to maintain peace in Greece while he was fighting in Asia. As a result, the divide Olympia widened her eyes as she waited between the mother and the general. But beneath her religious garb, she was becoming irritated out of maternal concern. Hadn't fought in a palace for years, just to have an elderly soldier rule them as cracks appeared throughout Alexander's empire, which spanned from Ion to India. He was straying from the mother and the gods that created him, taking on too much and putting too much confidence in outside counsel. She thought that she and heavenly favor were the reasons behind his achievements. If he'd forgotten that Olympus was adept at reminding kings of their true identities. If that king was her own son, when Macedon learned of Alexander's passing in Babylon in 323 BCE, it arrived like a dagger rather than a trumpet, and for Olympus, it wasn't simply. The universe she had spent decades creating came to an end with the death of a son. The heavenly storm she had foretold had been unleashed, and her boy was no longer there. He had left the powerful empire in ruins, with no clear heir and no heir. His so-called successors were already causing division among the generals he carved apart. Antiparta was still in charge of Macedonia and Greece, and he had already divided it up like jackals around a corpse. No affection for Olympus worse, the sister of her daughter Cleopatra. Alexander was being pursued for marriage by competing generals, each of whom hoped to claim her lineage as a claim to the. When Olympia realized what was about to happen, civil war was not a possibility. She would have to act once again, which was inevitable, but she didn't have. Instead, she possessed his lineage, specifically his infant son, Alexander IV. Alexander was born to Roxana, the Bactrian princess, and they were still married. The boy was considerably more exposed than Macedon, and Olympus realized that the baby was the final genuine remnant of her son's legacy, which made him a target, but also made him a weapon as well. She sided with Roxana and the boy in order to keep them safe, to assert her own claim in the political arena by using the child's birthright. But things were about to change. Generals who had previously bowed to Alexander had no desire to bow down to his mother or widow. Instead, they had armies and now had goals. Despite resentments, Olympus didn't recoil. She had encountered kings, traitors, and snakes. She decided that she wouldn't be frightened by warlords wearing crowns and spears that had been stolen. Waited and saw Antiparta pass away and be succeeded by a guy named Cassander, his son. He could not stand the old queen's games and had ice in his veins, so it was only a matter of time till these two forces clashed, Alexander's serpentine mother and the icy user who desired her. Alexander had been buried, yet his shadow remained. Years later, Olympus was still coiled inside it, poised to strike. Olympia made her boldest action to date after Alexander's death, when his empire collapsed into civil strife and she returned to Macedon, is a political force of divine wrath rather than a mourning mother. Cassandra, her former adversary Antipa's son, had broken the regency, taking over, and Roxana and infant Alexander IV were successfully Olympia, who was imprisoned, realized that if she did not take action, she would. At twilight, her grandson would disappear like a shadow, so she struck a bargain with Polyperchon, and an elderly general with a glimmer of genuine power would return, but not to plead, but to decide. And with Polypon's support, she went in Macedon, leading an army, and the instant her feet struck the ground at home, towns opened their gates, soldiers joined her, and everything changed. Olympias was hesitant by some of her former adversaries, even though she was still a name that rocked the earth. Then she got her revenge. She sought out the Cassander's supporters, and when she eventually discovered Philip III, Herodes Alexander's she, orchestrated the execution of his fake king and disabled half-brother, according to some sources. After Eurydice's wife declined to commit suicide after being taken prisoner, Olympus had her strangled. It was cruelty wrapped in Olympus and royal decorum. Acted out the incident as though a deity was administering justice, and her message was unmistakable. Only the lineage of, for a short time, Alexander had the authority to rule, and everyone else was a phony. Olympia reinstated the dynasty as soon as she seized control of the realm, had exacted revenge for betrayals. She had shown Macedon what it looked like for a woman with little to wield royal authority. Cassander was left to lose, but Macedonia's power was like fire in parched grass. He was still calculating and waiting, but he came back with a vengeance. Her friends were outnumbered by the army, and his resources were more extensive, ruthless, and cold. Started to desert her, Polyperon lost power, and the tide now swung in Olympus's favor. She had lighted the match Macedon had burned and waited, alone in the Pydna castle, as her foes closed in. Her adversaries were now at the gates of Olympus, where the most dense smoke had previously been. A woman who was feared in antiquity now found herself under siege in the coastal stronghold of Pydna, alone, encircled by Cassandra's soldiers who had come to complete the task his father had begun. But Olympias didn't plead with her, didn't beg. She bore the siege like a carved statue for almost a year. Food ran out due to divine wrath, disease crept in, and allies disappeared. But inside, the she carried the same unwavering presence that had once shook kings to the very end of the fortress walls. Cassandra was always wary, not as a prisoner, but as the mother of a deity. He was hesitant because he knew that murdering Olympus was risky, even though she still held a myth. Surrounding her like armor, she was still Alexander the Great's mother. Thus, it could appear blasphemous to strike her down. So he promised her protection, saying that if she surrendered, her life would be. Olympia was spared, since she was aware that too many royal promises had been broken. Death was her garrison, and hunger was no longer merely an inconvenience. Broke, her supporters gave up, and Olympias remained unwavering till the bitter end. Was ultimately turned over to her adversaries, Cassandra spared her life. Would have been too straightforward and forgiving. Instead, he gave her to the relatives of the people she had put to death. During her brief reign of power, they condemned her and let them decide her fate. The catch is that nobody dared to put her to death when the executioners arrived. Deliver the initial blow, Olympia stood erect and majestic, her silent gaze focused on them like an. They had grown up hearing about these Macedonians who were oracles gazing through smoke. Her kid was once praised as a living god by her rituals, visions, and snakes. Now, a slender elderly woman shrouded in legend stood before her, and no man had the bravery to brandish the sword, so Cassandra dispatched other strangers. Outsiders who were merely given instructions to follow and had no memory of her authority. So, at last, Olympus was brought down, not with fanfare or honor, but with silence. Her passing signified the end of Alexander's lineage in any significant authority, and the last remnant of an empire built on heavenly ambition was destroyed, yet Olympus survived. The serpent queen Olympus left a shadow that history would never forget, fell in the dust, unarmed, deserted, and put to death by the very individuals she formerly commanded. But history is peculiar in that it does not always work, in that those who pass away on silk sheets are occasionally remembered. Down hissing. And Olympus was never intended for a silent past. She had used prophecy as a shield and motherhood as a sword. She wasn't only the mother of one of the architects of Alexander the Great's ascent was her. Without her is devoid of the concept of the divine infant, rites involving lions and thunderbolts, and the brutal extermination of rivals that made it possible for a young monarch to govern the known globe. Olympus did more than create an empire. She protected it, with claws. But even among the most vicious dynasties in antiquity, Olympia distinguishes her from Cleopatra in that she did not lead armies in the campaign or ride into her battlefield, was more subdued and chilly than Boudicca's. It was a universe of she was aware of poison goblets, political marriages, priestesses, and oracles. The strength of dread, and more significantly, the strength of confidence. She persuaded others to believe in her son, was heavenly, and she might have even believed it herself. Her adversaries called her a manipulator, a witch, and a killer. Olympia was all of those things and more. She was the offspring of a harsh society that valued cunning over kindness, and she discovered early on that mercy was a luxury that queens couldn't afford. She was both demonized and mythologized in the centuries that followed. She was referred to be a criminal by some and a visionary by others, but no historian has ever. She plagued Alexander's legacy like a ghost, and modern people may deem her irrelevant. Phantom is constantly behind the curtain, in the background, and perhaps that's precisely where she belonged, as a story in and of herself, not as a tragic mother or a footnote in a king's tale. A woman who surrounded herself with prophecies, outlived gods, and slept next to snakes. Long after Olympia's bones were reduced to dust, her reputation lives on in every story of crusade queens, in every rumor of bloody fate in every established empire. She is still waiting on the sun-bleached island, coiled in the darkness, according to myth. Of Cree, a ruin that seems more like a dream than a reality, is located a few miles south of the contemporary city of Herakleion. Rooms twist and double back, while stone passages snake in all directions. Even now, it's easy to lose your sense of direction, because staircases lead nowhere. The center of Minoan civilization, Kenosis, is where the alleged one of the most persistent stories throughout human history was inspired by the labyrinth of the Minotaur. However, a palace that was unlike any other existed before there was a tale. Knos wasn't merely constructed in 1900 BCE and grew over the ages. Nearly 150,000 people lived in a royal residence that covered a whole city beneath one roof. It had more than 1,000 rooms, light wells, storage spaces, and magazines, shrines, workshops, and possibly the world's first flushing toilets had a complex air system, multi-story apartments with running water and circulation. To contemporary archaeologists, this was an architectural masterwork rather than a rudimentary stronghold. Appears to be well-organized chaos, but to ancient visitors, it most likely felt like magic. Arthur Evans, a British archaeologist, was the one who popularized Knos in the early 1900s, explored the location, and soon came to believe that this was where the Greek labyrinth myth originated. The design was confusing the highly symbolic architecture, and wherever he looked, he discovered bull patterns etched into stone, painted on walls, or molded into little golden charms. Ultimately, the bull was revered by the weather or if Minos was real. Minoan's Evans even went so far as to name the civilization after the legendary ruler. The ruins were inextricably linked to his legend. But here's the twist. Nobody's discovered a real labyrinth with no halfmen, prison cells, or underground maze. Monster. In its place, we have a much more enigmatic city built with layers, wings, and loops, purposefully challenging to navigate, and the distinctions between legend and history become increasingly hazy the further you go. Thus, the issue still stands. Did the palace or these walls give birth to the Minotaur? Although the monster numbers themselves are difficult to decipher, they are excellent at making us. The myth is as well known as the destruction of a monster halfman, so ask the correct questions. Half bull stuck in a maze so intricate that nobody has managed to escape save Theseus the A-ball of thread, and Princess Ariadne's guile allowed the Athens hero to defeat the beast and make his getaway. But where did this tale originate? And why did the early iterations of the according to legend, King Minos, the strong Cree monarch, required 7 youths as a sort of tribute from Athens? 7 girls were fed to the Minotaur, a beast created by divine intervention, each year. Punishment and embarrassment, The Minotaur imprisoned in an underground labyrinth represented the shadowy side of, for the Cree of ancient Greece. Power was something barbaric concealed under grandeur, been a place of riches, mystery, and terror. The Minoans were its maritime inhabitants. Bulloping their artwork was part of their ceremonies, which were perceived as both graceful and foreign. Showed bizarre gods with mansions that were unheard of on the mainland. For a Greek visitor from 1000 BCE, Nos would have seemed like a different planet. In Minoan civilization, bulls were considered sacred. In rituals depicted in frescoes, young men and women leap over rushing bulls. Displaying on altars and rooftops, stylized bull horns are used as horns of consecration. The elements of a legend start to come together when you combine this with a palace that feels like a maze. However, what if? The what-if Minor was more than just a monster? Some academics think the story may have been a metaphor, is a remembrance of Cretan supremacy over the Aean, a period when Athens genuinely honored a more powerful outsider. Power. The labyrinth may represent the political captivity of smaller powers, and the Minotaur represents the unadulterated terror of some. Contend that the labyrinth is more psychological than the driving factor behind Minoan rule. Theseus, the hero, and the unconscious mind, the Minotaur, as our unconscious desires. Walking fearlessly into the dark with only the thread of memory for guidance, the tale is still entangled. With Nos, the palace is the closest thing to a true maze that we have ever discovered. Monster, no Ariadne, but maybe something more profound, merely a myth that reverberated across history, but one that was begging to be myth long before Athens reared its. There were Minoan temples made of marble or Sparta that sharpened their spears. One of the first highly developed communities in Europe, they controlled via trade, art, and other means rather than by conquest. Appears to have an almost miraculous mastery of architecture, and Knossos was at the center of their might, a palace that served as both a royal residence and a center for cultural rituals. And according to Cree, the Minoans' economy flourished between 2600 and 400 BCE, extensive trading network that extended to Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Levant, and even the far reaches of Spain. Like stealthy arrows, they sliced through the Mediterranean, destroying luxury items, porcelain, saffron, and bronze. Construct enormous armies. They cultivated connections more than armaments, brought them wealth. The most remarkable aspect of Minoan culture is how distinct it was from that of its later Greek predecessors. Instead of glorifying war or violence, their artwork praised nature, animals, and human movement. Fresco portrays dancers, dolphins, and sportsmen jumping over bulls as a kind of divine retribution. Even their goddesses are powerful, bare-breasted, and frequently snake-wielding characters. Emblems of protection or fertility metamorphosis. At the heart of it all was Konos was a complex in a lush valley rather than a fortification on a hill. It had no enormous defensive fortifications that indicate the Minoans either felt safe on their island or had the strength to. They were confident in their ability to design multi-story buildings, thus defense was unnecessary. Advanced plumbing systems and colonized courtyards suggested a culture well ahead of its time, but despite all the Minoans were so sophisticated that they left no written records that could be read. We don't know why primary script linear A is still incomprehensible today. We don't know what their rulers thought, what prayers they said, or what they actually called themselves. Occurred behind Nos's fortifications. All that remains are their artifacts, ruins, and the Minoans are Greek myths that mimicked the Mycenaeans' later absorbed impact. Were architects of mystery as well as palace builders, and Nos wasn't just a structure, It was the beating center of a society that briefly glowed on the Aegean like sunlight before disappeared. But according to others, their echo can still be heard walking around Gnosis's maze, is to travel across layers of time which are beautiful and complex. It's not only the design is what overwhelms you. Corridors lead to other rooms, split and disappear. Light wells pierce the building's center, and the stairs spiral into darkness can abruptly appear in bright courtyards. Nothing moves in a straight line. One can easily understand why the ancient visitors would have said Kossos was more than just a palace. It was a living thing that stretched across in the complex, which was over 150,000 square feet, had more than 1,000 chambers. Small to large, these rooms weren't haphazardly arranged. They were intentionally constructed. Shrine rooms, residences, throne rooms, and workshops are all set up. The palace was constructed around a sizable central courtyard that might have been the site of public celebrations or bulling rituals. Several stories, often as high as 4 or 5 stories, utilizing both man-made terraces and natural slopes too. You would require memory instinct or a thread like that to get around it without getting lost. However, beneath all of this seeming disarray, Theseus' intellect, the Minoans, were adept at using open stairwells and air shafts for passive ventilation cooling rooms. They had toilets that flushed long before Rome made it popular, and they used clay pipes to channel rainfall. The throne room, so named because of the alabaster chair set into the wall, is one of the most recognizable spaces. It is surrounded by benches and a mural depicting the fabled protectors of griffins. Was this? Nobody is aware of a sacred court, a goddess's chamber, or the seat of a priest or king. Certain, and the walls are colorful, with vibrant frescoes depicting dolphins, young people swimming over bathtubs, women wearing flounced skirts with exposed chests. The artwork was not merely ornamental. It was a very fluid and natural representation of individuality, linked to the water and the ground. But the further you travel, the more Nos starts too. Some sections appear purposefully complicated, as if they were made to. Perhaps that is the origin of the labyrinth legend, a castle that felt alive rather than a prison for monsters. No barred doors, no fabled animals, a structure that evoked awe, ceremony, and a hint of fear. It was merely designed to make you wonder where you were and what might be around the next corner. Corner Nos was more than just a royal home or administrative hub. It was of worship, a ritualistic architectural manifestation of the Minoan soul. In contrast to later Greek temples, there are no myths or divine mysteries. Marble shrines to Athena or tall columns to Zeus in place of the spiritual. The kenosis realm is more subtly incorporated into the structure itself. Shrines are concealed in nooks and crannies. Ascend like holy sentinels. Stylized carved symbols of horns appear on altars and rooftops. The bull theme predominates everywhere you look, signifying a strong link between cherished animal worship and the natural world. It appears that the Minoans were not afraid of the bull. In fact, they celebrated it. The well-known bull, leaping fresco at Nos, isn't only. It might show young men and women leaping over a religious object in sports art. It wasn't sport. It was a charging bull caught in a graceful and dangerous dance. Sacred theater, perhaps a sacrifice to the gods or a representation of victory over disarray. Next are the snake goddesses found in storage spaces. The snake goddess statues beneath the palace are among of the most recognizable Minoan sculptures. Artifacts, bare-breasted arms uplifted, with snakes wrapped around or in their hands. These statues exude strength from their physique. They are not obedient idols. Snakes represented fertility in the home and even life itself to the Minoans, earthly and underworld creatures of rebirth, mystery, and regeneration. The rooms. The locations of these items suggest solitary ritual areas or home shrines. In addition to the fresco, there are holy nooks tucked away in the busy center of the palace. The entire complex starts to feel ritualistic, including the horns, altars, and winding hallways. Machine, a building designed not only for habitation, but also for communication with the heavenly knows, does not have a central temple, as the palace was a temple's design, layout, and artwork were all influenced by a spiritual philosophy, where there were no distinctions between the sacred and the mundane in this place. And myth was architecture, in which each echo in the stone chambers may serve as a conduit to the gods. Were formerly a silent prayer. Nose didn't only house people, it housed gods. For ages, Nose was a symbol of wealth, creativity, and cultural sophistication. But then an unexpected event occurred, something that no one can really describe. By 1400 BCE, the palace the Minoan civilization that once dominated the seas, had disappeared like mist over the deserted fresco, which had been let to decay. Theories exist on what happened, Aeon. Some attribute it to nature around 1600 BCE. Today's Santorini, the volcanic island of Thera, erupted in one of the biggest explosions throughout human history. The blast was so large that it probably resulted tidal tsunamis. That destroyed farms and ports along the northern coast of Sit. Although the destruction of Knossos wasn't imminent, clouds might have obscured the sun, strangling crops and altering the environment. Others believe that the eruption's consequences may have rocked the foundations on an economic, political, and spiritual level. The growing strength of the Mycenaeans on the Greek mainland may have led to war by 1450 BCE. Exploited Minoan weakness. Archaeological evidence indicates that Nas was temporarily captured again, but the art became more martial linear A, the Minoan script, and the culture had evolved, was swapped out for the Mycenaean writer's linear B. Some experts talked in a strange language amid the palace that was once teeming with bull dancers and snake goddesses, that the Mycenaeans progressively occupied the island, first through commerce and subsequently through invasion. Others contend that internal breakdown will eventually lead to dominance. Political instability, a civil insurrection, or the elite's failure might have contributed equally. Yet it's remarkable how little violence is visible in the ruins. There aren't any burnt nose did not fall with a yell. Rather, they did so with a skeleton and no indications of mass bloodshed. Murmur. The rooms fell silent, the rites ceased, and the enormous palatial system just halted, concluded, and the natural world gradually returned by the time Homer sung of the Cree in his epic's Nose was already an old myth, a memory entwined with kingly tales, labyrinths and monsters, which may be appropriate given that what killed Konos wasn't, whether it was an invasion or an eruption. Time and the way were all wonderful things. How lovely things gradually fade under the influence of new empires. However, the bones are still there, and if you listen carefully, the maze continues to hum beneath the Gnosis, was buried beneath the Cretan dirt for thousands of years. Another pile of stone that has been lost to time. Its name has been forgotten. Its stories have warped its dust and olive orchards, engulfing the walls, until one guy chose to pursue a Sir Arthur Evans was a legendary figure who accomplished more than only rediscover Gnosis. Redesigned it in 1900 by British archaeologist Evans, who loved Homeric mythology and had a flair for theatrics, bought the land that covered the old ruins. Local farmers had been discovering odd seals and hints from items that, under their feet, Evans discovered something massive. What he discovered would alter the course of Aeon history forever. He discovered a palace so large and intricate and so developed that he believed this to be the legendary residence of King Minos. The site's fresco, horns, and overall architectural oddity, everything suggested to him that the Labyrinth Evans wasn't only he was an archaeologist who told stories, often controversially. He deciphered symbols for the Minoans, who built Konos after Minos, repaired portions of the palace with reinforced concrete, and rebuilt the fresco. A decision that has generated both admiration and condemnation. Some refer to it as visionary, while others term it vandalism, because the current state of Gnosis is a combination of an old ruin, and Evans's Edgewardian imagination allowed him to do what no one else had the courage to do. Reviving Caucasus allowed Europe to see a world from the Bronze Age, a seafaring and artistic civilization that predates classical Greece beauty. In addition, he discovered the undiscovered linear script that opens a new concerns regarding language proficiency and the boundaries of our historical knowledge. But Evans went above and above Digstone. He brought a myth back to life and made historians face the reality that behind the story of the Labyrinth was a castle that was both real and intricate, yet very human. It resembled a labyrinth, a society that vanished into darkness, and a guy who pulled back the ground to find a more beautiful and wilder story. Nos had slept for 3,000 years, longer than he had thought. Evans sounded the alarm. And when you pass through Gnosis, you're not merely, when you go through architectural structures, you're traversing a language of symbols. Fresco carvings and patterns are, however, the Minoans left us without a Rosetta Stone, their main script. Since linear A cannot be decoded, we must observe rather than read their thoughts. Them concealed in patterns, etched into walls, and painted over plaster. What exactly were they trying to convey when they said that Knosis's work is unique among the ancient world? There isn't any fixation on instead. We find nature, not rows of kings or battle-hardened warriors. Humans are leaping dolphins, flowering leas, flying birds, and sacred bulls, lively, graceful, and frequently dancing or carrying out ceremonies, even in situations that imply danger. There is beauty and rhythm, and the Minoans weren't recording conquests. They were commemorating life cycles and even the order of the cosmos. However, the most recognizable emblem is the double axe, or labrys, which is seen in shrines all throughout the world. The twin axe is thought to be a holy symbol that is depicted on frescoes and even carved into stones. Symbol that could be connected to celestial cycles or female divinity. Some people even propose the phrase, labyrinths may be derived from labis, which would make them anything but mazes. However, a home of the double axe is a place of worship rather than a trap. Next are the consecration horns, which resemble bullhorns, are positioned on altars and upper walls. These might have used as religious markers to distinguish between holy and secular areas. Given the regular representations of bulls and bulloping customs, it is evident that the animal had profound spiritual importance. No one can agree on whether it symbolized a divine presence, fertility chaos, or nature, but the bull is everywhere. Even the Konos layout might have symbolic significance. Some archaeologists think it was constructed not only for use, but also to reflect seasonal or cosmic patterns. Its nested rooms and twisting hallways could symbolize a spiritual journey through life, death, and the underworld. Although a maze is not a real prison, every theory goes through a The Manawans spoke with symbols rather than narrative, so we're forced to walk the fine line between insight and imagination, understand Gnosis' statement that we see the pictures and hear the rhythms, but the significance that eludes comprehension like a thread unraveling into myth. Gnos is a wreck, to be sure, yet it feels alive. If you walk through its hallways today, you'll hear a murmur just beneath the surface, the echoes of tales, lives, and questions that are not ghosts or gods. Thousands of years after its fall, Gnos continues to ensnare us in its labyrinth. Explore its corridors. Archaeologists delve for solutions, and authors create new stories. The Minotaur may be a myth, but the sense of the labyrinth, inspired by its shadow, is genuine. But we don't know who was in charge or who its kings and queens were, or priests. We don't know what laws they lived by or what prayers they muttered. However, we are aware that they revered nature, valued beauty, and recognized the harmony between art and architecture, between ritual and reality, and we are aware that they existed before the Parthenon, Rome, the Hebrew temples, or the Persians. Palaces, including Gnosis, a palace that doubled as a city, and a city that doubled as perhaps that is what the labyrinth truly is, a temple that was also a story. It's not a jail, nor is it a puzzle, but a fable in architecture, a story etched on stone form. The myth of the Minotaur didn't just appear. It originated here from the awe it inspires, the devotion of its bull ceremonies, and the bewilderment of its passageways. The Greeks transformed it into a story, and we transformed it into something that motivated generations of people who attempted to understand it. But fundamentally, Gnos has always been both, and we can now explore its ruins during the day, allowing us to take pictures, create maps, and even reconstruct. Despite its fresco, the question remains. The distinction between fact and, perhaps it is why Gnosis endures, legend still glistens like heat over stone, because it reminds us that history isn't always meant to be solved and doesn't provide us with all the solutions. Intended to be experienced, and Gnos's ancient, convoluted, half-remembered location is more than just a spot on a map. It's a query that, like Theseus, takes us farther with each stride. Ancient engineers knew exactly what they were doing, and we're all still following the thread. Where performing teams of soldiers only raised the first rams, which were handled. Like crazy lumberjacks, they battered a tree trunk against opposing defenses, but over time, the pounding. As the ram developed, engineers discovered that installing it inside a wheeled frame, it changed from a tool to a weapon of war by frequently having a roof to shield the crew from arrows and boiling oil. The masters of siege warfare, the Assyrians, transformed rams into psychological weaponry. The combination of rams and archer platforms in its siege towers meant that a city's while defenders were constantly being fired upon, gates were being destroyed. Nineveh relief carvings depict rams. Like slow-moving gods of destruction, it rolls up to the gates of rebellious cities with pointy iron tips. Rams were frequently employed to break weak spots in walls, so it wasn't simply the front entrance they were destroying. Watchtowers or completely collapsed gates, their existence signified one thing. The Greeks perfected them. If you don't, your fortifications will fall apart like stale bread. Roman architects created enormous rams known as ares, which is Latin for ram hanging, with some of the massive siege shelters required dozens of workers to operate due to their chains or ropes. And the rhythm. Despite all of their physical energy hammering, it was claimed that the sound of their swinging beam was like thunder hitting stone. Operators had to work as a team to maintain the ram swinging in the sink. a halted while protecting it from flaming projectiles, stones, and other noxious materials that were thrown from above. When a battering ram started running, it was still a dead ram, was invincible. It was ancient physics. It pitted human masonry against wooden muscle, weaponized, and this was just the first example of how engineers would cause barriers to collapse. If the battering ram was the brute, the strategy where rams destroyed close-up catapults that were launched from. They were the first to launch not only stones, but also fear in people's minds. Actual pieces of artillery in military history, and they transformed siege warfare by using physics as a weapon that the adversary perceived as nearly miraculous. The first catapults appeared in the Greek civilization in the 4th century BCE. The result of creative minds seeking to give combat more range and energy, Dionysius the Fur of Syracuse the first torsion-powered catapult devices were commissioned by a despot who enjoyed extreme brutality. Weren't slingshots. Instead, they employed knotted bundles of hair or sinew as tension springs. They were exact tools of siege horror for giants, and their genius was in their mechanics. Engineers discovered that by tightly winding ropes, frequently composed of animal sinew, they could store massive quantities of potential energy that, if released, could launch stones. The two primary kinds are javelins and even flaming projectiles that may travel hundreds of meters. Developed swiftly, including the stone-throwing catapult and the ballista, which fired enormous bolts like a big crossbow, which threw stones straight at strongholds or over walls. Next came the Roman engineers, who never encountered a Greek concept that they were unable to enhance, so they constructed detachable catapults that could be loaded onto carts, and portable siege engines for professional armies that can be put back together on location. Roman catapults were able to shoot 60-pound stones at amazing speeds, smashing through battlements, wooden gates, and sometimes unlucky warriors. Catapults were used for spectacle as much as damage. In order to convey signals, ancient generals would occasionally literally launch corpses over fortifications. Illness and terror. In one horrifying instance, severed heads were thrown into besieged cities to lower morale. In the early days of biological warfare, bodies were launched into enemy territory, but catapults had drawbacks. Heavy needed experienced workers, and poor terrain may make them ineffective. However, if correctly positioned, they might safely beat a city into submission, and for the first time in cities throughout history, understood that their sturdy stone walls needed to endure more than just a ram. They also needed to endure the skies, since devastation was now flying, and if the catapult had been smart, the imposing, towering, creaking, and menacing trebuchet was the undeniable. When one showed up on the battlefield, it was the king of medieval siege warfare. Was more than just a weapon. It was a declaration. Your walls mean nothing. The trebuchet relied on gravity instead of its tension-powered cousins. Its basic idea was a long, swinging arm supported by a strong, using a frame with a sling on one end and a heavy counterweight on the other. Lift the weight, let it fall, and the arm would whip around, launching the lethal payload and the sling over enemy defenses in a high arc. This was controlled destruction. The trebuchet's exact, predictable, and destructive origin can be linked to the Chinese's usage of traction models as early as the 4th century BCE, when labor substituted counterweights. But the variant that would alter siege warfare in Europe was the counterweight trebuchet, and the Byzantine or Muslim cultures may have contributed to the rise of the Islamic world in the 12th century. Intermediaries. The design quickly spread like wildfire once Europe acquired it. Through crusades and castles, the power was incredible. A well-constructed trebuchet could throw 300-pound projectiles over 300 meters, and furniture-sized stones would collide with towers, destroy walls, or destroy enemy morale. But the true magic was in the arc. Trebuchets, as opposed to catapults, could launch projectiles over walls with skill, so they weren't merely destroying defenses. Striking interior supply depots, barracks, and courtyards, and it wasn't simply stones. Everything was flung by trebuchets, even sick animals and lime pitch pots. Even insults or messages wrapped around blind protectors' rocks. According to a legend during the siege of Stirling Castle in Scotland, Warwolf was a colossal trebuchet. The king refused to accept the fact that the adversary gave up before it was even launched. Give up in order for him to test the machine. But despite its destructive power, the trebuchet wasn't quick. It took no other siege weapon has been developed, despite hours of construction, minutes of reloading, and the need for competent engineers. It was the medieval era, combining psychological horror with range power. Cities held their breath as that counterweight fell, resembling a slow-motion hammer from the sky. While battering rams and distant catapults destroyed the gates, siege towers adopted a more intimate strategy. They dropped off armed invaders at the enemy's home door after rolling right up to it. Picture a wooden skyscraper on wet-heighted wheels to stop archers and spearmen from battling fire. The siege tower was the prehistoric counterpart of a mobile fortification and an armored personnel carrier. You knew the real battle was about to commence when one of these began to thunder toward your city's walls. Siege towers were enormous, bold, and terrifyingly effective when deployed. They weren't subtle. The Greeks were the first to use them. However, the Assyrians may have been among the first around the 9th century BCE, and particularly the Hellenistic kingdoms, who went to dramatic lengths with the design during the siege of the Roots in Demetrius. A Macedonian general constructed a 9-story structure in 305 BCE called with its catapults the Helpolis, also known as the Taker of Cities, was more than 100 feet tall. Thousands of troops dragged it, and it was encased with iron plates. It also shattered under its own weight. But the ambition, the reasoning behind siege towers was straightforward. Walls only function if you can't. Siege towers removed that benefit by establishing a raised platform that attackers might use to, from the top, climb ladders and avoid gates to descend onto the battlements. While troops on the lower levels were getting ready to board, deck archers could shower death down on defenders, but these not only were towers slow and susceptible to mud, but they were also easy targets for rolling boulders or even sabotaging terrain with fire arrows. Astute defenders would construct supplementary inner walls or dig ditches to prevent flooding, referred to as counter-scarp defenses, which are used to halt a tower's approach. However, when they did an amazing job. A wall breach was one thing, but having your own rampart suddenly crowded was quite another. Siege towers changed the battlefield from a chaotic area with hostile soldiers to they transformed height from a horizontal struggle for dominance to a vertical struggle for existence. And once, there was no going back after the gangplank fell from a siege tower to the city walls. It was time for hand-to-hand horror, with trebuchets soaring and rams smashing. Some of the most destructive subterranean siege tactics took place in silence, with the dark tunneling or sapping technique for overthrowing a city by destroying the foundation it was built upon was horrifyingly effective and ancient. Dig beneath the enemy's wall to support it, using wooden supports, and when the timbers burned, light those supports on fire. The wall's foundation was taken with it when the tunnel collapsed. When your city was powerful, a huge, portion of the outside wall appeared next. This approach didn't appear magnificent. There were no magnificent engines or loud explosions, but tunneling was the Assyrians' gradual, undetectable method of castle warfare. Practiced early iterations of it, but the Greeks, Persians, and later medieval peoples brought the method to its ultimate completion. In 429 BCE, European soldiers were besieging Plateau, and the Spartans attempted to tunnel beneath the walls, but they were intercepted in the middle of their dig by the defenders who dug counter-tunnels, transforming the ground into a nightmarish knife war. This defensive strategy, which came to be known as countermining, added an spooky aspect of siege warfare. Picture soldiers excavating hundreds of feet below the surface in complete darkness, ground listening for enemy pick sounds. As soon as they detected tapping, they would quickly try to intercept, which frequently led to... There was no glory in the bloody, cramped battles waged by torchlight with knives and shovels. Dirt, suffocation, and horror. But when the undermining process outcomes were disastrous, one of the most notorious instances occurred during the siege in 1212. King John's troops gathered beneath the southern wall of Rochester Castle in England and filled the mine with pigs, fat, and set it on fire. The tower above it collapsed when the supports gave way. The siege in the 13th century stunned the defenders, who eventually gave up. Engineers become experts at determining weak foundations by analyzing the behavior of the earth and making plans. Collapses with horrifying accuracy. They were a combination of demolition specialists and geologists, and even though digging required a lot of work and a little bit of insanity, but it demonstrated one siege warfare reality. You could always tear it down from below if you couldn't go through or over the wall. Not all the attackers provided the drama of siege warfare. For each ram constructed or tower hauled forward, the defenders had their own lethal tricks, and occasionally those tricks were sexy. Let's begin with the scariest all-Greek fire, which the Byzantines created in the 7th century. CE. Fire was an enigmatic, napalm-like material that adhered to body and ship walls and continued to burn even on. When water was thrown into clay pots or sprayed from siphons, it produced scenes of pure chaos. No one is certain how it was created to this day. The formula was so. The fact that it perished with the empire was kept a secret, but its consequences were legendary. Whole fleets were reduced in a matter of minutes to burning skeletons, and it was only the beginning. The preferred weapons of choice for more low-tech defenses were boiling liquids. Murder holes were charming perforations where people would pour water, oil, or sand. Oil was particularly dreaded when the ceilings of castles or gateways looked directly down on intruders. Before being set ablaze, the water stuck to the skin and soaked into the clothing and armor. Imagine descending a siege ladder to find yourself confronted by flames that you could never extinguish. Drama was inherently cruel and would slink into armor's crevices. Particularly around the wrists or neck, it fried the flesh underneath, resulting in second and third-degree burns. Appear magnificent from afar, yet it transformed brave fighters into yelling wrecks in defenders used the time-tested rules of physics as well. Gravity became. As a weapon, parapets launched giant stones, logs, or even dead animals upon siege engines or crowded groups of there were hidden traps, and the objective was not only to kill but also to instantly destroy the morale in machines. Bridges that collapsed, spiked barricades, pits, and castles that turned into puzzles of pain intended to gradually perplex and punish, all of this had the same goal. Delay. The enemy's supply lines were getting thinner, and sickness was spreading every minute a wall was held. camps or to incoming reinforcements, siege warfare was an attrition-based game. Additionally, the defenders had ingenuity and a great deal of raging anger during the siege, while the assailants had the advantage of physics. Only half of the objective of warfare was physical destruction. The other half was psychological dominance. Shattering the siege weapons weren't merely instruments of war. They were enormous, and the defender's will was evident long before the walls fell. Every groaning wheel of a siege tower, every burning emblem of death, every trebuche-thrown arcing rock was intended to sow one seed in the thoughts of people inside the walls. You are not safe. The Assyrians displayed their siege engines, and the ancient commanders were aware of this. With much fanfare, the Romans brazenly dragged them across deserts. They constructed their siege camps directly in front of the enemy, allowing defenders to observe the assembly of battering rams and the testing of catapults. Fear was a part of the narrative for siege, and occasionally the payloads themselves conveyed a message. Generals or messengers' heads would be hurled over the walls. Frequently, while still wearing their defensive forces at the siege of Constantinople were pelted with diseased corpses in addition to rocks. Intended to sow fear and pestilence during the Kafir-Mongol siege in throwing bodies afflicted with the plague over the walls, is thought to have contributed to the start of the Black Death epidemics in 1346. Europe. The trebuche served as an announcement as well as a weapon. When one of these giants was rolled into position, and before anyone inside the fortress saw it, they could hear the winches creaking. The pounding of the counterweight and the grinding of the ropes resembled the heartbeat of an impending storm, yet the most hazardous, the part that was unknown. You had no idea what would happen next. Of fire, a shower of arrows, or simply a dark, oppressive quiet as engineers. Even the noises turned into psychological weapons as they changed their objective. Defenders would become extremely anxious in anticipation of a shot or the steady thump of a battering ram. The objective of commanders was to instill hopelessness in order to persuade the adversary that fighting was futile and that their gods had left them believing that their barriers were merely transient roadblocks in the course of destiny, and when the gates were ultimately broken, they frequently opened without any resistance since siege warfare. Occasionally, as gunpowder thundered onto the masonry, the mind fell apart. The era of conventional siege engines on the battlefield in the late medieval period gradually came to an end, although their legacy didn't disappear. Rather, it transformed. The creation of cannons altered everything. A well-aimed cannon blast might accomplish in a matter of seconds what a trebuchet took hours to attain. Stone walls that were once thought to be impenetrable turned becoming liabilities. By the 15th century, iron balls, not fire or deterioration, were causing Europe's major castles to fall apart. They crashed through their parapets, signaling the beginning of the next phase of siege warfare, which was explosive, terrible, deadly overwhelming. But the guidelines established by the ancient siege engineers never vanished. The catapult and trebuchet continue to be a source of inspiration for modern artillery. All long-range howitzers and ballistic missiles are really sophisticated versions of the same query. How do you break physics trajectory tension and what is supposed to be indestructible from a distance? Centuries before gunpowder was invented, force was discovered, tested, and refined. Ever made an appearance in the novel, including military psychology today. Ancient siege techniques are the source of overwhelming firepower and apparent dominance. Flags flapping in the wind as those imposing siege engines rolled forward weren't simply about breaking through a wall. They were the first shock and awe. Were about shattering a city's soul, and their legacy is still visible today. Entering Masada's historic city remains, where Roman siege ramps are still visible, the desert in Constantinople, where walls had been erected for a millennium against every kind of machine until they were ultimately destroyed by cannon fire at castles around Europe, where angled bastions and circular towers depict a universe that is continuously changing to survive the next siege. And even in today's day of satellite-guided missiles and drones, cities are still encircled by siege warfare, which has simply gone digital. Defenders remain separated, and walls have evolved into firewalls, media, or blockades. Darkness, but the siege's essence stays the same. Someone wants to enter. Someone wants to keep them out, and both of them are prepared to wait for things to happen. Triumph. The trebuchets are museum exhibits. The battering rams are no longer there, yet the siege warfare's spirit is as vibrant and destructive as ever.